From the heart of Maine, this is the DuView Podcast.
All right, and welcome to this week's episode of the DuView Podcast. I am your host, Du, a.k.a. Ryan Dumont, and I'm bringing you guys a solo episode this week, just me, no guests in the studio. Going to do a little bit different of an episode this week, and I'll get into that in just a couple of minutes, but I wanted to start you guys off with something a little bit on the lighter side here and talk a little bit about my most recent trip up to camp with the guys. So, I mentioned that in the last episode with my good buddy Aaron Bernier, episode 19. Thanks again, Aaron, for coming on. Greatly appreciated, bud. That being said, though, we went up to camp literally the day after recording that episode, and we had a fucking fantastic time. Excuse my language, but it was that good. You know what I'm saying? Like, I apologize for dropping the F-bomb in the first minute of the episode, but it was that good of a time that it deserves the expletive. So, that being said, there were about 10 of us that went up. Going up to up on the camp up on Sebec Lake, which is owned by the Antworth family, as I've mentioned before, good family friends, longtime friends of mine. This year was super icy, and not a whole heck of a lot of fish were caught ice fishing. They do call it slow beck for a reason because, there's sometimes not a lot of action. Although, to be fair to the lake itself, some people have pulled some monster fish out of there. It's just, hitting it right as with anything, as we talked about last episode, Aaron and I, about fishing. It's not always a foolproof thing. You do go, there are times where you go home empty-handed, right? That's with anything when you're outside hunting, fishing, any of that type of stuff. You don't always get something, right? And that's kind of, I guess you could say there's some life lessons there as well. But the pinnacle or the highlight, I guess, of the fish caught was my buddy Connor was out ice fishing by himself and with some other folks at the other end of the lake, and he pulled out he caught basically a bait fish off a bait fish. Which, that's impressive because, that means that whatever he put down his hole, that something was just big enough to, grab onto it. Again, that is the description of the fishing trip that weekend. Like I said, the fishing wasn't great. When you manage to catch bait off bait, that's kind of setting the theme for the rest of the weekend. So again, not a lot of fish were caught, but a good time was had regardless. Because, as I was kind of saying earlier with Aaron and, in previous episodes, it's hard to get everybody under the same roof. Like I said, when we were in high school, we were inseparable. We'd all be together, anywhere from 8 to 10 of us. It was a great time, and we had a lot of fun doing it. But now, unfortunately and eventually, you all got to grow up and get jobs and all that good stuff. And so, we have, half of us, not half of us, but, a handful of us are out of state. A handful of us live, across the state. Like I said, Casey lives down in Massachusetts. Stu lives in New Hampshire. Aaron lives halfway across the state of Maine, down on the coast. I can't say down east because he corrected me last time. So that being said, but he lives halfway across the state. We all work. I mean, the rest of us all work like 60 hours or so a week. We're busy people. The other handful of the guys work down at the yard. Connor's a firefighter, so he's working a lot. And it's just hard to, like I said, it's just hard to get everybody together in the same room for an extended period of time. And that's just the highlight for me of, again, not many fish were caught. The trails were kind of crappy and you really couldn't do much snowmobiling. But again, it was just the utter fact that we got everybody together under one roof. And that's what really makes all the difference in the world. Unfortunately, definitely gone are the days of, playing Xbox all afternoon, sitting on a couch and, then snowmobiling all weekend. Like when we were younger, however, we get together with weekends like that, or like going up to camp. And that makes it all even more special for sure. And so with that being said, I just wanted to start off with something nice and light, talk about, going up to camp because this episode we're going to be getting into the war in Ukraine. I just have to talk about it. It's too big of a world event to just kind of ignore. As you could probably tell, it dominates the news cycles and whatever else. And, I plan to, work has been busy. That being said, so, I'll have guests back with my next episode. And, on that front, every day is a learning experience. But I really wanted to have this episode focus on the war in Ukraine and not just the current events that are happening with the war, but what happened previous. Because let's be real, folks, and if you've listened to this podcast, you know I'm a lover of history, a student of history, and I come from the, historical knowledge world, if you want to call it that. So with that being said, I care too much about, nation sovereignty and the few things that maybe don't cross everybody else's mind, but is still important, to having a good functioning, global system. And part of the reason you're like, well, dude, why are you talking about this? Yeah, it's a huge event, but you mostly focus on Maine, and it's like, it does affect Maine. Mainers, we have Mainers that have Ukrainian heritage, that still have family over there. There's stories on the news about people that were in the process of adopting kids from Ukraine. And these are Mainers. These are kids who are going to be future Mainers and could go on to be future whatever, for the state of Maine. So that being said, though, it does directly affect us in a big way. I mean, I can, to touch things off with a personal family anecdote. My great-grandmother was a Russian Jew. She didn't know it. She was raised as a Russian Catholic, because not a Russian Catholic, but as an Irish Catholic rather, because she was adopted, right after the Tsar's Revolution. Her father put her up for adoption. And she ended up, coming to the United States, and was, again, raised by Irish Catholics, so she always thought she was Irish Catholic. And come to find out, she's actually a Russian Jew from the Pale region, where, the Russians put all the Jews, because of, anti-Semitism and segregation. And Russia's had its own problem with anti-Semitism and such, along with much of mainland Europe. But that being said, though, it even has, in a way, a direct, indirect connection with me. I can think of some personal family friends who, whose grandparents or great-grandparents or whatever left Ukraine because of the communist uprising, and I'll touch on all that stuff later. But the fact of the matter is that it's a more interconnected issue than what people are really given credit for. And, I hate to say it, but it'll be interesting to see where this thing takes us, because, this is just the beginning of the conflict, folks. And it's not even just the beginning. It's kind of the tip of the spear. This has been going on since even before, I say 2014 as a kind of date where you had Russians directly fighting Ukrainians, or, Spetsnaz, special forces going into the southern part of Ukraine, but I'm getting a little too far ahead of myself. The fact of the matter is these two nations have had a long, difficult, interconnected history, and a lot of the time it's been the Russians that are treating the Ukrainians poorly, which is ironic because, at the end of the day, they do more or less come from the same region. Like, culturally, they can trace their heritages back to the same area. But like I said, I just can't let this conflict go by and not talk about it, giving my, interest of study, and just my interest of world events, and as well as just giving a damn about world events too. I want to break things down from my perspective here, and so here comes a true DuView episode. Welcome to the DuView Podcast special episode, the report on the war in Ukraine. So this, just to preface this episode features research, features from NPR's Becky Sullivan's, as well as my own independent research. I only have so much time, so I do have to let the experts play their role as well. So that's where I'm getting my research, as well as my own independent research, because like I said, I've attended talks and studies on the former Soviet Union, now Russia. Keep in mind, I also went to Cuba and attended a few, talks from professors on the University, of Havana, talking about the role of the Soviet Union. So I have a pretty good understanding about, the Russian culture and history a lot of the time, less so on the Ukrainian side directly, to be honest with you. But, my area of focus when I took a lot of classes in college for my history minor, I was, focused mostly on European history, most of the 20th century, but also, the modern era post-Renaissance type of deal too. So with that being said, I do have a pretty hefty wealth of knowledge of that region for being somebody who's, from the United States and doesn't do, historical work full time. So with that being said, not half bad, for what I'm doing here. So that being said, take what I say with a grain of salt. I do the best research and the most thorough and unbiased research that I can find. And so, like I said, to each their own, and take that with a grain of salt. That being said, trigger warning or whatever you want to call it, if you don't agree with what I have to say, too damn bad, turn it off. So that being said, let's go ahead and get started here. It's honestly, with this event, because the two nations are so interconnected, it's best to start right at the beginning. And I apologize in advance throughout this section. It's a little long-winded, and I may be stopping to take periodic, water breaks here. So if I cut off for a second, that would be why. It's not easy being long-winded, guys. So that being said, yes, Ukraine and Russia have had an interconnected history. However, the two are very much two separate sovereign nations, regardless of what Vladimir Putin says. That's been one of the biggest problems of this event is Vladimir Putin is literally trying to rewrite history. And so that's another reason I felt compelled to kind of do this episode. I realize what I do is on a much smaller scale, but it's good to remind folks the real reasons things are happening. Not because some despot in Europe, decided he wanted to go claim more land and rebuild the Soviet Union on his own selfish accords. But that being said, the two countries have shared a culture that goes back more than 1,000 years to the time when Kiev, Ukraine's capital, was the center of the first Slavic state. The Kievan Rus, the birthplace of both Russia and Ukraine, as I mentioned before. In AD 988, Vladimir I, the first pagan prince of Novgorod and the Grand Prince of Kiev, accepted the Orthodox Christian faith and was baptized in the Crimean River of Chrysonesus. Again, I apologize for any of these Russian Slavic names. I am not a linguistics expert by any means, so I apologize if I slaughter any names here. So later Ukraine was carved up and warred over by various powers and empires. Again, it's had a heavy connection with I guess you could call the early foundations of the Russian Empire. Keep in mind, this is 988 AD, not, a couple hundred years after the fall of the Roman Empire. This is really early on, folks. So again, like I said, Ukraine has been battled over for many years by various powers and empires. From the 13th century to the 17th century, Ukraine was battled over for power with the Mongol warriors from the east, Polish and Lithuanian armies from the west, and then finally, more than a century later, right around 1793, try that again, 1793, the right bank, or Western Ukraine, was annexed by the Russian Empire. And in the years that followed, a policy known as Russification was used to study the Ukrainian language, and the people were pressured to convert from their own faith to the Russian Orthodox faith. So this is the first, 1793, you see the first real push for Russification of the, Ukrainian people. More followed, there was more atrocities and, changeovers into the Russian style or operating procedure, or, falling under the Russian guise, continued on until well into the 20th century. Keep in mind, you had the czars running Russia for the longest time, and they I guess Ukraine was kind of like their Australia in some ways. They'd send prisoners there or whatever. I know Stalin had a huge role in that later on, but you have to keep in mind, though, Ukraine plays a huge role in the development of Europe because of how fertile it is. And that's what people either glance over or forget, that Ukraine is actually one of the most fertile pieces of farmland. It's kind of like the Kansas of Europe, that you can just grow and grow and grow things. It's really fertile land. It's really good soil. I believe it's like black soil or something like that. Like I said, the dirt's almost black. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's dead on there. So that being said, the Russians, like I said, the Russians and Ukrainians are always very heavily interconnected. And that being said, the Russia being the stronger power kind of exerted its influence on Ukraine and on a lot of the other smaller countries, in that area that would come to be, Poland and Lithuania, Estonia, and then towards, more towards the Asian side, you have Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and all these other, different places that, eventually became under Soviet guise. When Tsar Nicholas was taken out in the October Revolution, when he was removed from, I guess, office, or when he was dethroned and killed by the communist forces in 1918, 1919, and the communists finally eventually beat the whites and took over the country, with Vladimir Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin, of course, and so eventually Stalin would wrestle his way to control over the Soviet Union, performing, kangaroo courts and, taking out his political enemies, or even, people that helped him, start the movement, or, were early, OG communists, that, and again, we see, a lot of the problems coming today, again, when the leader of the country, being Vladimir Putin, his favorite historical figure is Stalin. So, I mean, you can definitely probably tie some parallels there. That being said, though, it's definitely interesting as, the Soviets didn't create any goodwill towards the Ukrainian people at all, because Stalin actually orchestrated a famine that resulted in the starvation. I'm not trying to laugh at that, but I mean, it's just kind of like, as a matter of fact, like, here's, the continuing of rough relations between the Russians and Ukrainian people. So, again, like I said, Joseph Stalin orchestrated a famine that resulted in the starvation and death of millions of Ukrainians. Afterwards, Stalin imported a large number of Russians and other Soviet citizens, many with no ability to speak Ukrainian and few ties to the regions in attempts to repopulate it. So, like you said, he killed a lot of the peasant Ukrainian farming folk. Like I said, and he committed massive atrocities all across Russia. It's not just Ukraine or all across the Soviet Union. It's not just in the Ukraine, Soviet, but in the the other Soviets. I mean, the mass migration of forced migration of people to Magnitogorsk and other Magnitogorsk. For those who don't know, was a massive, I believe, steel production city or a massive production industrial city that was created out of nothing in like the heartland. I believe it's out near like Chelyabinsk and out in the Urals in the center of the country. But that being said, though, you move people from literally one ass end of Russia to the other ass end of Russia, and with little food, little creature comforts, little anything, other than just pack up and move and put what you can on your back. That's no way to, again, treat your citizens. Again, just my opinion, growing up in Western democracy. But that being said, like I said, Stalin forced many of Russians into Ukraine. Many of them didn't even speak the language. Again, while interconnected, again, the two are still very separate, as we see today. Again, the two are literally separate sovereign nations, regardless of what Putin would like to say. These events, of World War II rolls around right after the Soviet uprising. A lot of the time, the Nazis were seen early on as kind of like liberators because they promised the Ukrainians some type of nationalism, but when in reality that was a ruse as well. And they just wanted to, take the region for its own. Again, Hitler was really interested in expanding, like the land for, ethnic Germans being blonde hair and blue eyes. So he wanted to, push all the Slavic people out of Ukraine and turn it into, the Lebenstraum, the fertile, good living land. So that's why they sent the Einsatzgruppen, which is like the Nazi death squads, and other groups into Ukraine, into Russia to take out Jews, take out Slavs, take out Gypsies, and other, folks like you saw similar with the Holocaust. I mean, this was going on at the same time as the Holocaust, and a lot of Russian Jews and Russians got, and especially even Ukrainians were moved into concentration camps after, the Nazis moved into the region. And just massive atrocities, just forcing people to dig a pit and then having, they find these mass graves all across Russia and Ukraine and a lot of in Poland and these other areas that saw such horrific, I can't even find the word, horrific circumstances, I guess is what I'm going to say here, through the 20th, early 20th century, late 1930s and into the mid 1940s. And, things didn't automatically get better by any means, because after the end of World War II, even though the Nazis were taken out and the Russians the Soviets retook everything, I mean, you now have the full-blown, communist takeover of Eastern Europe, which was also known as the communist bloc or the Soviet bloc. And we see that Ukrainians are not happy about, not all Ukrainians, the majority of Ukrainians are not happy about being under the guise or under the thumb of the Soviet Union. And that being said, we see different events throughout history in the 1960s and 70s as time went on in Poland, the Solidarity movement and things, and that eventually would spread to the rest of Eastern Europe. And by the time the 90s rolled around and the Soviet Union was on its last legs, I mean, people were ready to full-on revolt and, put up their own flag in a very literal sense, which we'll see here in just a couple minutes with the Ukrainians by the time the 90s rolled around. And so, like I said, there was a lot of nasty stuff that happened, under communist guys, under the Soviet bloc. And this is also something I need to touch on before going any further into history. It's around this time, late 1940s. I believe it's even some in the window. I have a hard time remembering. Apologize, from like 1946, 1949. NATO comes into existence, right? I'm sure that's not just something that popped out of existence, but the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was literally created to in a lot of ways to combat the Soviet bloc, to protect Western ideals, Western democracy, and basically to protect democracy in Europe after the rise of fascism and communism, as we saw in the early part of the 20th century, or in the earlier parts of the Second World War. That being said, though, the things start to open up. There's, glasnost and perestroika under Gorbachev in the late 80s and early 90s. And like we said, we could tell the writing on the wall was clear. And literally the wall was about to come down in Germany in the sense that communism was on its way out. Western democracy had won, for better or worse. And this is how things were going to be. Europe was going to move to a place of Western liberalism and getting away from communism. And, a huge reason why we won was just because quality of life. You look at quality of life in the Soviet Union at that time, and it was pretty bad. Like, no blue jeans, no consumer goods, no soap. Like the basic things that, we could go to the department stores and get, they couldn't. Or you'd have to wait in a queue for an apartment or for a car. Like you don't just automatically, or you're not just able to go out and buy things. Everything, under the communist system of Russia, or their socialist system, whatever you want to call it, they basically the state controlled what you did. The only industry that wasn't regulated directly by the government was the fur trappers, up in Siberia. Because how do you regulate? That was the only capitalistic, basically, business left after, the Stalin takeover. And like I said, things changed with different Soviet leaders, rather. Some were more open, but at the end of the day, communism still had full control over the nation as a whole. And up until, again, we get into the late 1880s and early 1990s. So with that being said, by the time 1889 rolls around in 1990, anti-communist protests swept through Eastern and Central Europe, starting in Poland. And in Ukraine, January 1990, more than 400,000 people joined hands, creating a human chain that wraps over 400 miles from the western city of Ivano-Frankivsky to Kyiv, the capital, in the northern part of Ukraine. The large majority waved blue and yellow Ukrainian flags. This flag had been banned under, Soviet law, under Soviet rule. So this was a huge, event for the Ukrainian people. They were, it's the first real instance, we see here in the early 90s of the Ukrainians pushing for independence. July 16th, 1990. The Rada, the Ukrainian parliament formed out of the previous Soviet legislature, votes declare independence from the Soviet Union. Authorities recall Ukraine soldiers from other parts of the USSR and vote to shut down the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine. So again, this is another huge point of division, between the Russians and Ukrainian people, because if you've not lived under a rock for the last 20, 30 years, that there's the massive event at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant on which reactor 4, I believe, or reactor 3, one of the two, melted down, and due to a maintenance error or something like that, eventually blew up. And so you literally had, pieces of graphite and, radioactive cores and lead and things like that scattered over, because literally the reactor blew up. And, the response, the poor firefighters that were in response to that event, had radiation burns and it was just terrible. And the Soviet Union really tried to hide and keep that under wraps, but we over here in the West figured it out when all the nuclear particles started to drift into other parts of Europe and even into the United States, and it affected the groundwater. It affected the animal life. They had to kill. I think they cut down like all the trees and killed all the animals because radiation and infection and radiation poisoning. Just as a normal standard for that time period, unfortunately. Because again, when you have a nuclear reactor blow up, it's such a traumatic event, as we saw, Fukushima in Japan more recently. Again, don't build your nuclear power plants on top of barrier reefs. Again, the Soviet nuclear program was also pretty. They've had many nuclear accidents, so to speak, that they've covered up. There was an event, I believe, in central Russia that was even worse than Chernobyl, and you don't really hear about it. There are some great videos and documentaries out there about that. I can't remember the name of the exact explosion off the top of my head, but this happened, I think, even in the 50s. It was long before the Chernobyl experiment, or the Chernobyl explosion, rather. But that being said, Chernobyl was an interesting sticking point for the Russian and Ukrainian people, because the cleanup was a massive undertaking. It's still going on underway, which I'll touch on a little bit later. But that being said, we see here with the cleanup event, Russian soldiers had an option at the time, because the Russians were fighting over in Afghanistan at the same time. Keep in mind the mid-'80s. So with that being said, the Russians gave some of their soldiers an option. You can either go to the front line in Afghanistan, or you can serve, 5 seconds or 10 seconds or a minute or whatever it is on the roof at the Chernobyl power plant, shoveling the spent fuel rods and exploded, reactor pieces back into the hole so they can seal it up. The as you could guess, the fatality rate was incredible. I mean, you lost. I mean, and if you didn't die, you got heavily irradiated. Because let's be real, their radiation gear was not what we have today by any means. It's just like, here, throw on this protective clothing, put on a gas mask, and choke on some iodine tablets. All right, I mean, I guess. But that being said, that says a lot. If folks were willing to not go to Afghanistan and were willing to, shovel nuclear fuel rods and, get radiation poisoning, basically. So that being said, the Ukrainians are trying to go their own way by 1991, and this doesn't exactly go according to plan. So following a failed coup in Moscow, the Ukrainian parliament declares independence a second time on August 24th, 1991, a date that is still celebrated as Ukraine's official Independence Day. In December, Ukrainians actually voted to make their independence official when they approved the declaration in a landslide, 92% of votes in favor of independence. The Soviet Union officially dissolves on December 26th. So again, Ukraine is now officially a free country, and that leads them to do what free countries want to do: look out for their own safety and their sovereignty. And so in 1992, Ukraine formally forms relations with NATO, but does not become a member state. And this is going to be the sticking point, folks, for the whole rest of this podcast episode, really. Ukraine joining NATO. It's like the catalyst for everything that is going on now on top of Putin's own selfishness. That being said, we move on from 1992. NATO, again, I'm doing the short version of this, guys. I mean, I could have like 3 or 4 podcast episodes just on Ukrainian history. But that being said, I'm just kind of giving you guys the short version, timeline version. So, if you are curious as to how we got here, you have, some type of answer. So that being said, we get into the mid-90s, 94. And in this time period, this kind of covers 94 to, 2004, give or take. So, the mid-90s to the mid-2000s. So with that being said, in 10 years as president, Leonid Kuchma, I apologize for slaughtering that name, helps transition Ukraine from a Soviet republic to a capitalist society, privatizing businesses, and working to improve international economic opportunity. But in 2000, his presidency is rocked by a scandal over audio recordings that he revealed his order to the death of a journalist. He remains in power for about 4 more years. So this is another huge problem for Ukraine, is that and also the former Soviet nations in general, this is not just a problem unique to Ukraine, is corruption. Now, corruption goes hand in hand with a lot of your former Soviet Union countries, including the former Soviet Union itself, Russia. After the 90s, the majority of Russia is really kind of run by organized crime. And you could argue part of the reason Putin is still in power is because of his ties with organized crime. But we'll get into that a little bit later. Keep in mind, while all this is going on, good old Vladimir Putin is, a member of the KGB. Folks, if you didn't think that a guy who's killed people, he's like basically a CIA operative, for Russia. KGB is their equivalent at the time. You put somebody in power over there that's literally killed people with his bare hands. Probably has killed bears with his bare hands. So that being said, what do you expect when the guy was a warmongering asshole? So, I mean, you kind of, unfortunately, you don't really get to choose that situation, but you kind of get not what you pay for, but you get what you get in a lot of ways. If you put a former spook, despot wannabe, Stalin student in power, well, unfortunately, we're going to have problems like this. But that being said, I'm getting ahead of myself. That being said, we get into issues continue well into the 2000s over Ukraine joining NATO, as I mentioned, due to pressure from Russia. Russia likes buffers, and this is a historical, psychological thing. Even going back to, I mentioned, the Mongol invaders in the 13th century, it did a deep psychological number on the Russian people and the Russian leadership, the Russian government. So Russia has always liked to have Poland and those other smaller European countries as buffer space before mainland Russia. Poland is a literal, a causeway in a lot of ways, right to the Russian heartland. You can march through Poland very quickly and move right into the Soviet Union. So that's why they've always they're moving to Russia. That's why they've always liked having their extra little buffer zones. And I mean, we did it here in the United States with Manifest Destiny or whatever. We like having sovereignty over what's around us, and at the same time, you can't fault them for that. But you can't just go invading other countries in order to do that at the same time. So that's where we kind of hit this slippery slope in a lot of ways. I mean, that Putin wants more than just Ukraine. I mean, we've seen before in, I believe, 2008 in Georgia. We've seen in other, former Allied or former Soviet territories as well. And we'll get into that a little bit later. In 2014 when Russia actually invades Ukraine, the southern part of Ukraine. But we'll get into that in a minute. So in 2005, we have a new presidential election. President Yushchenko takes power with the promises to lead the Ukraine out of the Kremlin's orbit and towards NATO. Again, the issue of Ukraine joining NATO continues because as Putin doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO because it gives more power to the West and the European Union and kind of puts Russia on an iceberg all of its own. That's because he doesn't want to westernize and he doesn't want to lose power. He doesn't want to democratize because while they may have quote-unquote elections in Russia, they're not really elections. It's, oh, wow, Putin's party won again, and he's still in office. I mean, he did a little cutesy little trade-off thing with one of his buddies and confidants that, he took over as president, and then Putin dropped down to prime minister for a term and then came back as Russian president. And again, this is president very loosely. He's a dictator. He's a despot. He runs the show. He's also one of the most wealthy people in Russia. So if you don't think he's not doing that by skimming off, the Russian oil companies and what little GDP Russia has now, you're foolish. You're lying to yourself. So that being said, in 2008, we see NATO promises Ukraine will one day join its alliance. Yushchenko wins. We have a presidential election. Yukonovich takes over in 2010, and in 2013, his government suspends trade association talks with the EU and starts moving back to economic ties with Russia, triggering massive rallies in Kyiv. So this is where we're about to get into the war in the Crimea. This was the first real catalyst for what's coming now. This kind of really set the stage for the invasions from the east and from the north, from Belarus. Because also another thing to note is Belarus is not really an independent nation. It's a Russian puppet. The leader of Belarus is basically a Putin puppet. So that being said, when you hear Belarus in the news, think Russia 2.0 or Russia Junior. So that being said, when you have the change in leadership and the corruption of the Ukrainian country, they start moving back towards Russia. Russia obviously had gotten Russian sympathizers or Soviet sympathizers in, and that's a huge sticking point for the Ukrainian people because fighting and restarting a whole new system, especially a whole new democracy, is not easy, as we've seen in these areas that have tried to democratize around the world. It takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of collective buy-in from people. And you don't always get that collective buy-in because you have a lot of folks who are nostalgic, just like I'm nostalgic on, I wish, the Beatles were still around. They're nostalgic. Life was so much better under the Soviet Union. And perhaps for some people it was. Like, you listen to some people talk like they had more jobs and this, that. But also, too, you have to understand that change doesn't come overnight, and creating a good society for yourself requires good collective buy-in. I'd argue that's why we have a lot of problems in our country right now, is because we don't have a lot of collective buy-in from people. We may have collective buy-ins that we want to be Americans and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but after that it kind of fades away. But what I'm trying to get at here, guys, is that in order to start a new, open, transparent, democratic nation, you have to get rid of the corruption and be transparent in a lot of ways, and that was not happening. Again, as we see in 2014, February 2014, the Ukrainian parliament votes to remove Yanukovych after the bloodshed of the protests. Within days, armed men seized parliament in the Ukrainian region of the Crimea and raised the Russian flag. Moscow later annexes the territory. So this is when the Russians officially move. They're not wearing Russian patches and armor and everything, but you can tell that they're trained by Russians. You can tell that they're Russian soldiers wearing different uniforms. And Putin loves doing these type of false flag and, smoke and mirrors type shit. You have to remember he was in the KGB. All right? So he's going to lie and bullshit and say, that's not the truth, or that's or whatever, propaganda, because that's what he grew up on. That's what he knew. That's his bread and butter in a lot of ways. So with that being said, Putin has Russian troops in the Crimea. The Crimea is a very interesting region of Ukraine for a lot of reasons. It is also the city of Sevastopol, which is like the capital of the region, or the heartland of that region. Also was the home of the Ukrainian naval forces. The headquarters, their admirals, their ships were all headquartered out of there. They didn't have a huge navy, but what little navy they did have was headquartered out of there. That is now claimed by Russia. Another thing that they did, the city's geographic location and the whole Crimea's geographic location is awesome for launching short-range tactical nuclear warheads at the rest of mainland Europe, including England. So that goes back to even Soviet times, where the strategic geographical points are so important from a military perspective, or from a let's start a nuclear war perspective, I guess. That's another thing that scares the crap out of me with this situation. I'll get into that when we talk about the modern, things a little bit more modern. Like I said, February to March 2014, the seizing of the Crimea, the Ukrainians are very much not ready for it. As I said, I mean, their leader is literally taken out of power. Corruption is so rampant in the country that they have a problem even fighting back against the Russians. And again, keep in mind that Ukraine is not a NATO member. It doesn't, isn't protected by Article 5, which states that, if one NATO member is invaded, all the rest NATO members come to its aid. NATO is not an offensive pact. It is a defensive pact. It is to dissuade or, suggest, hey, don't attack this small country, because the power of the United States military, the French military, all the other, global powers are going to come down on you. And, the French military and the English militaries are different than what they were years ago. But between that with American backing, it's a tour de force. Real tour de force. NATO is the one thing keeping Putin from, just taking over all the former Soviet bloc countries. Lithuania, Estonia, and all these other small countries, Poland, are all protected by NATO. And again, this is where we could end up with a world war. If Putin gets greedy and decides to move into one of these other NATO member countries, Article 5 has to be invoked. It just has to. You got to stand ground against things here. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So again, this really set the stage for, war part 2, or, full-fledged fighting like we're seeing now. So I'm going to, end off the episode by talking about the war today, and things in the last couple of years. So, in 2019, former comedic actor Vladimir Zelensky is elected president. He is the current president of Ukraine. He is leading his country through, like I said, a time of hardship and war. He has not had an easy time as president, I'm sure. I'm sure it has been an uphill battle every step of the way. He's been fighting not only internal corruption, but also external pressures from Russia as well. And this is where it gets interesting, folks, and it might piss a few of you off, but too damn bad. So that being said, in 2020, we see at the brink of the 2020 election, President Trump has a phone call with President Zelensky to pressure him into investigating Hunter Biden. That being said, Trump says in return for investigating, saying he'll, investigate Biden's kid, in the private, in the public eye rather. If he announces that, then he'll send him a bunch of defense systems. Now, this creates a problem, folks, because not only is President Trump almost impeached from this, and it creates a whole other laundry list of problems. Again, I'm coming from this angle as a former Republican operative, a former worker of the GOP, and again, just somebody who doesn't like Trump because he's not a real Republican. That being said, though, to get off my own personal problems with him, the missile systems that were tied up in this quote-unquote deal are the same missile systems that are keeping the Russian attack from moving very, very quickly. And even this week, President Trump's own former national security advisor, John Bolton, even was quoted saying, quote, "Putin saw Trump doing a lot of his work for him, so he chose not to invade Ukraine," close quote. So, as we saw, folks, Trump was making it very, very easy for Putin to prepare for this type of invasion. And, you can hate on Joe Biden, hate on gas prices. That's not what I'm here to talk about today. What I'm here to talk about is that the Ukrainians were basically being hung out to dry by the Trump administration. You can say what you want, all right? Say what you want. Oh, he's the greatest president of all time. No, he's a shit president. He's a traitor, and he's a walking national security risk. What do you think he talked about with Putin at Helsinki or with the Russian foreign minister behind closed doors, and those tapes aren't allowed to be released? Yeah, I know I have a pretty good idea what they were talking about. And Trump's also funded by a lot of Russian-backed banks. He can't get a loan from any American institution anymore. So you tell me about a conflict of interest. Again, the guy is a walking national security risk. And again, I'm not looking at this from a position of hatred, just for the man. No, I'm looking at this for the security of my own country and my own fellow countrymen. I mean, I have friends and family in the armed services and other things like that. And, to hang out the Ukrainians to dry would not have been the right move at that time. And so luckily we had a presidential election and the aid was eventually sent to Zelensky. And those are when I talk about aid, I'm talking about money. I'm talking about troops training Ukrainian soldiers. So basically, from 2019 onward, we've had American advisors over in Ukraine helping whip their military into shape. And also, we sent them a nice package of Javelin missiles. If you've never heard of Javelin missiles, they kick ass. Basically, you can't mess with them. They're laser guided, from my understanding. They are very lightweight, and you can basically train the average civilian on how to use them. And also, Russian armor does not defend well against them. They don't have the defense systems, or from my understanding, it was explained to me from a former Army guy that the missile, the U.S. tanks, U.S. armor has this like mesh or material that you impact the missile first, but the Russian tanks don't have that, and they tried to make like improvised versions of this like mesh metal armor to have the explosive hit first and whatever. But case in point, they have weaker armor, and the Ukrainians, with some aid from good old U.S. of A. Uncle Sam, was able to hold off the Russians, and they've been actually doing a pretty darn good job, considering how small the Ukrainian military is, and the majority of the Ukrainian military now is made up of civilians from ages 18 to 60, because they've basically had to have a draft. All right, so that being said, that deal was quite important, and again, was even confirmed by Trump's own ex-national security advisor, John Bolton. If you don't believe me, look it up. January 2021, Zelensky appeals to the U.S. President Joe Biden to let Ukraine join NATO. In February, his government freezes the assets of opposition leader Viktor Medvedchuk, the Kremlin's most prominent ally in Ukraine. So again, even though we have a democratically elected leader in Ukraine, the Kremlin and Putin are still trying to put their guy in power so they can take Ukraine back from using an internal method via using military force. Again, you have to understand Putin's down to do this type of smoke and mirrors type shit because, again, as I've said, maybe the third or fourth time this episode, he was part of the KGB. All right. So that being said, we get into spring 2021. Russia begins massing troops near Ukraine's border, claiming it to be under the guise of training exercises. Well, I hate to tell you folks, but every time Russia's invaded another sovereign country or sovereign territory, Georgia, whatever that territory may be, they've always said, oh, we're just doing a troop exercise on your border. And also he uses an event similar to like the Olympic. Every time there's been like an Olympics or some big world collective event going on, Putin waits for it to end and then attacks. He did that in Georgia. He did that after the Helsinki Olympics into, the Crimea in 2014. So again, folks, all this stuff is all interconnected. And again, the more that people can see world events being interconnected, and all this stuff has been building for, let's be real, like 20 plus years at this point. I mean, I'm sure Putin, again, I can't confirm or deny this part, but I'm sure Putin has had a long planned out plan. That's kind of stupid sounding, but you know what I'm saying? A long planned out, exercises for reclaiming the Soviet Union. I mean, that's pretty obvious. That's what he wants to do at this point. And if you can't see it, read a book. But that gets us into, 2020 winter, 2021 rather, 2021 winter. Satellite images probably taken by the United States, good old CIA looking out, or NSA looking out, goes to show Russian buildup forces near Ukraine. Estimates, were at over 100,000 troops, and that turned out to be true. That was the first round of invasion forces that came into the country. On Thursday, February 24th, Russia finally invades Ukraine. Our Western nations send aid and sanctions on Russia and Putin himself. Now Russian forces, as the time of I'm recording this, are about 10 miles from Kyiv. Again, like I said, at the time of this recording. So it's kind of unclear as to where we'll go from here. I don't really have. I mean, I can only guess really what's going to happen from here. This is where we get into like the real what's the word I'm looking for here? The bread and butter, so to speak, or the meat and potatoes, rather, of, use a different food analogy. Obviously, I'm hungry. But the meat and potatoes of this issue, and it's that Putin wants to control Ukraine and doesn't want to increase NATO control. And so, with that being said, NATO has, and the Western nations, including the United States, have to tread very carefully, which I will applaud. Yes, I will applaud President Biden's handling of this. He knows that if even, like we talked about this week, or the news they talked about this week, Poland sending Russian-made fighter jets to Ukraine through a NATO base in Germany. Just the fact that those planes would even touch the NATO base in Germany creates a whole laundry list of problems. The fact that Poland is a NATO member state causes a whole laundry list of problems. Again, we're not trying to escalate things any further, but at the same time, we can't just let the Russian economy is crippled and falling. We're not buying Russian gas anymore. That all came out in the last week. But that being said, is it enough? Is it enough to dissuade Putin? I mean, he's even threatened Finland and Sweden with if they join NATO with dire consequences, or the hellfire and wrath type stuff. Putin is not currently fit for office, folks. From reporting states that he is very sickly. He's kind of blotchy and pasty if you look at him. He's incredibly paranoid of COVID. He's been more or less kind of isolated and locked up for the last couple of years. So on top of that, you have one of the men with one of the world's largest nuclear arsenals who's really not in the right headspace right now. And so that's where I really kind of want to talk about mutually assured destruction a little bit. MAD, a concept that came out of the Cold War in the 60s. If you've ever seen the movie Dr. Strangelove and How I Learned to Love the Bomb, which is a great movie. Highly recommend everybody go and watch that. Stanley Kubrick did a great job with that movie. A little wacky at times, a little zany, but it really kind of puts things into perspective for you in a lot of ways. And again, people, and you talk about this in history classes, you talk about this in, poli-sci classes, would someone really push the button? Because, again, keep in mind, folks, we've only used nuclear bombs really once, in war. In World War II, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, everything from there on has been tests and, just blowing up missiles and bombs to blow up missiles and bombs. So I'm not trying to, put fearmonger here by any means, folks, but got to be mindful of this situation. And before you say, oh, let's just send American troops over there, let's go kick Russia's ass. Well, we could also start one of the most damning conflicts this planet has ever seen. So, again, you got to tread carefully. And yes, carry a big stick, in the words of Teddy Roosevelt. But you can't let things get out of control, just for the sake of power, just for the sake of your own power. So, again, this puts us into this really difficult situation. And obviously, my biggest concern is the Ukrainian people, the civilian populations, because the Russians are committing war crimes. They're committing war crimes, plain and simple. You don't target children's hospitals. They've blown up children's hospitals. They're using, warheads that suck all the oxygen out of the air right before detonation. Those are a big no-no to use against civilian populations. You're only supposed to use those on military targets. And I wouldn't be surprised, again, you saw the Assad regime, which is backed by Russia and Syria, use chemical warfare against its own citizens. I wouldn't be surprised if Putin gets desperate enough that he uses chemical or biochemical warfare in Ukraine. I wouldn't be surprised about it, unfortunately. And that's what kind of leads us into these just stories of sadness, but also stories of hope and bravery of these people that are hanging on and helping people get out. And that's another thing that we have to consider, folks, is that Europe's about to see the largest refugee crisis since the Second World War. There's no need for this. Again, this was all started by Russia, by Putin. Not even Russia, but by Putin. Just based off his own greed and want for power and lust for power. This has nothing to do with, and again, the interesting thing is, though, when they talk with Russian soldiers on the ground, they're being told by their government, they're being brainwashed by their government, they're saying that they're fighting Nazis in Ukraine. They're saying they're help to denazify the regime. I hate to tell you, folks, but Zelensky is a Jew. He's Jewish. All right? So there's not a lot of Nazification going on there, all right? So again, the whole guise or reason that the troops are being told that they're there is bullshit. So again, it's just, some folks deciding to, make calls and, as it's always been on the world stage, a few fat cats sit around and make calls that end up, creating turbulent and terrible lives for, normal civilian populations. And that's the worst thing I'm seeing here. And that's why I want to see this conflict really wrapped up soon, is because the Russians are doing terrible things to the Ukrainian population. But at the same time, shout out to the Ukrainian citizens, though. They're standing up. A lot of them are fighting, and they're defending their homes. It's hard. Again, the Russian invasion has not gone according to plan because people are defending their homes. It's no different than when the United States went into Vietnam. I mean, under different reasons or whatever, but people are fighting for their homes. They're not gonna go down easy. They're gonna fight to the last tooth, man, nail. And that's what we're seeing out of Ukraine right now. The biggest thing is they just need more support. And that comes in the means of food, that comes in the means of ammunition and armor. And I'd love to see the Ukrainians get some SAM, some like air land defenses, to take out Russian aircraft, or launch counterattacks against Russian artillery. Again, I've never been in the military. I don't know that much. Again, I'm not a military strategist or anything like that. But this is just off of my own basic understanding of the world, reporting, and a few my years doing stuff with politics and international relations. I mean, I've met a lot of interesting folks from all different corners of the globe, and at the end of the day, really what we need is we have more that unites us than separates us, really, at the end of the day. And it's too bad that, again, one person's greed and lust for power, or a handful of people, him and the whatever other oligarchs, is resulting in such pain and such horrendous events for the Ukrainians. So, like I said, that's my breakdown of the events. Like I said, there's a lot more to it. Obviously, like, you can go really in depth in Russia, Ukraine, and Germany in World War II, and through the communist years, the Soviet bloc years, and you could even go into deeper history from 2000 to 2022. But that being said, I just want to kind of give a brief overview of the whole conflict, and just to have people understand it goes back more than just to February. It goes back more than just to 2014. This has been an ongoing issue forever, and we're just kind of hitting the catalyst, guys. We're just kind of hitting the culmination. It's all coming to a head. So, like I said, my heart goes out to the Ukrainian people, to the Ukrainian citizens, to the Ukrainian military and soldiers. Keep on fighting the good fight. You guys are doing what's right. And to the Russians and to Putin, stop. Please stop. There's enough problems in the world right now without having to fight a third world war. I don't want to be drafted. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I'm just saying that I don't really want to go fight a war. I enjoy, camaraderie and peace, and I don't feel the need, while I have experience with firearms, I don't feel the need to have to go over and fight right now. So with that being said, I'm just hoping for peace. This is the DuView Podcast, call for peace, world peace, I guess. You can call me an idealist, call me a fool, but you can have some type of basic peace, guys. That being said, I just wanted to highlight this whole conflict. Like I said, it's ongoing, and we'll continue to see how events unfold, and I'm sure I'll continue to cover it here for you. So this has been the DuView Podcast special report on the war in Ukraine. I hope you guys learned something from this, and continue to follow current events. Like I said, follow an array of sources. If you just watch Fox News, don't just watch Fox News. Like I said, we used to work for them. If you watch MSNBC or just read HuffPost, just don't read and listen to those guys. Get a whole culmination of different sources, because odd times the real truth, the real story is right in the middle between the two. So that being said, do some of your own research, and stay up to date on things, and really try to discern what's real and what's not. Be careful sharing pictures of fighter crafts and things like that in country, because they might be fake. They might not be real. Russia's a huge propaganda factory, so keep that in mind when you're on Facebook. And again, folks, Facebook is not a news source. I can make up a story for Facebook News just as easily as you can. So with that being said, mindfulness, folks, mindfulness. So again, just go out, be a decent person. Like I said, I'm just trying to call for some camaraderie here, regardless. So we need to, put our heads together instead of bashing our heads together separately. So with that being said, just wanted to highlight the Ukrainian conflict. Hope you guys will continue to tune in on another couple weeks for my next episode. I'll be back here with a new guest, highlighting the best parts of Maine life, music, general adventures, general shenanigans and adventures. So that being said, guys, be sure to tune in another couple weeks for a whole new episode. Stay up to date with us on social media, DuView207 on Instagram, and the DuView Podcast just about everywhere else. We're on Amazon Music. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. So write us a review. Give us a couple stars. That'd be awesome. Really helps fight the algorithm, so to speak, and helps get the podcast out there. So greatly appreciate all you tuning in. Hopefully everybody learned something this week. I know I sure did, putting all this together. So that being said, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you like more episodes like this in the future, I can happily do it. Not no skin off my my back, so to speak. So really enjoyed talking with you guys about the conflict in Ukraine, and we'll continue to cover it as we move forward. Like I said, keep up to date with all the DuView goodness on our socials, and have a great couple weeks, guys. Stay safe, and if anybody has any, Ukrainian family or whatever, my heart goes out to you, and I hope everybody's safe and everything goes well. Here's to a hopefully safer and happier 2022, folks. Have a great week, and I'll be back in a couple weeks with a whole new episode.